morning, my beautiful babes and babettes. I'm your resident active advocate, and I hadn't worn this shirt in months. I think I forgot I owned it, but anyway. Today, I would like to do a version 2.0 on my Heritable disabilities video. Now, last time, I may have given you the bare facts of the issue, but I'd also like to give you my opinions on this issue. I'm not going to age restrict this one either because I think this is a far less contentious issue than the one I discussed yesterday, which is ability selective abortion. But when it comes to heritable disabilities, with the technology that we have now, being able to dissect and test your two parents' genomes before they go to have a child, personally, I think that that could be a very responsible decision. There's always a margin of error when it comes to medical testing, okay? There's going to be a margin of error to some degree. If I were to do this myself, I would research not only what that margin of error is, but also how they conduct the testing and the reasons why in society this testing is commonly done. A lot of the time, genetic testing will be done so as to determine whether a couple should have children or not, because the societal conception of disability, as we have discussed, is that people with disabilities are lesser than and by nature are going to have crummy lives. However, as I talked about yesterday, it is up to us to create systemic change, not change based on individuals. It is no individual's fault that society is the way it is. Society is a compilation of events throughout history, of religion taking over this area, of politics taking over this area, of the two combining forces, and basically making a big mess of things, I think. I'm not an atheist, by the way, but a lot of the, quote, moral model does come out of the religious model of how disability is viewed. The moral model, again, quotation marks, is very much ingrained into Western society, and one of the issues that can arise from much more accurate genetic testing is that science will perpetuate the moral model, even though that is a more religiously inclined model. But science may even say, in the abstract sense, well, we don't need or want more people with disabilities to, be alive and have to be taken care of and all that stuff. And that perpetuates the idea that people with disabilities are lesser than. And that is not beneficial to anybody, especially to people with disabilities, but also to the people who are judging them. Because if you create this highly negative mindset of the people you are judging, you will naturally create the us versus them dichotomy, and them is always inferior to us, right? I've discussed this in previous videos, but there are those sort of 4 tiers of how society is constructed. Us, like us, not us, and them, right? And them, whoever them is in the moment, because them tends to change decade to decade, but they're always seen as the ultimate evil, the ultimate beneficiary of everything that had been taken from us. It was taken from us by them. And this is, content warning, verging on fascism. Okay, this is fascism light, I would say. Conservatism heavy, fascism light. The whole idea of there being, there must always be an in-group and an out-group, but the out group is much more flexible than the in group. Basically, it's whoever we don't like this decade. You know, Islamophobia was in vogue in the early 2000s for reasons. It's still somewhat in vogue, but near constants tend to be homophobia, ableism, and misogyny. You know, those are kind of the big three in Western civilization, because Western civilization is profoundly patriarchal. But the patriarchy doesn't just have to do with sex and gender, it also has to do with the whole construction of society in its pyramid. When it comes, therefore, to deciding whether to have children based on even the possibility of passing down a potentially heritable disorder or disability, that is up to the parents who are involved and should not involve society's rather low standards. Because the whole problem with society is, quote, we don't want to have to deal with them. You know, them, again, using that word because they're not, quote, us. It depends on the severity and the nature of the disability. I find that this is much more of a visible factor when it comes to highly visible disabilities or to people with intellectual disabilities. It's not quite as bad, it's not quite as bad with people with social disabilities of any kind. So let's say Asperger's or mild to moderate depression. If it gets worse than that, then people are going to start calling you, quote, weak and, you know, man up. Which is interesting because there's no feminine equivalent to that phrase. You know, no one says woman up. But again, the whole expectation is that people are supposed to look this way, act this way. Society determines your role for you, and you are stuck in that role no matter who you are and no matter what you do. And that is also where the, quote, super crip narrative comes from. The whole idea that people with disabilities must be extraordinary in order to just be considered, quote, proper human beings. That is an open manifestation of how society views people with disabilities. Because people with disabilities are, quote, them, or at least are, quote, not us, then we must try harder. We must do more to fit even into like us. But I don't think, with the way society is set up right now, that we can ever be, quote, us, right? We can never properly fit in because we don't fit this arbitrary mold that's been created. But if I were to give you the stipulations of the mold, give you every stipulation of the mold, I would like to see how many people you know who fit every single stipulation. Okay? I'm not going to give them all here because it's a long list and it's certainly not an exhaustive list. The list of who us is will also vary between the generations, but there are much clearer demarcations between us versus them as opposed to who us can be. And I do appreciate the fact that society is somewhat stretching the definition of us. You know, it's getting a little bit wider. It's starting to include women. It's starting to include, quote, people of color or people of different races. Starting to. But as I say, if we're only at the starting point and it's already 2021, we're not doing so hot. And I am a political and social leftist, and I want to see more progress, which is why I'm making this series at all. So, heritable disabilities, to get back to the point, I think that the parents involved should decide based not on society's arbitrary standards, which, as I say, are constantly changing, but based on their capacity to care for the child and to mentor the child. the whole thing is that if you have even one solid, stable mentor figure in your life, you can do a lot more, regardless of how severe your disability can be. You can do a lot more if you have even just one solid person teaching you the ropes and teaching you how to function in a society that doesn't like you. And I'm sorry to put it so bluntly, but it's true, okay? A lot of the time it can be true. And there are tiers of disabilities, as I have said, like, I hate to lay it out like this because it disgusts me, but a blind person or a visually impaired person is going to be lower on the hierarchy than a deaf person, is going to be lower on the hierarchy than, just someone with, say, mild Asperger's, and so on and so forth. I wouldn't be able to tell you what form of disability is at the top of the social pyramid, but I can definitely tell you which ones are more on the bottom. If you have an intellectual disability, for example, and let's say mentally you don't grow up, people are going to see you in certain ways and they're going to treat you as a child forever. I actually do know a person with an intellectual disability severe enough that they have to live in a group home and are taken care of by other people. But that does not mean, and by the way, this person is 3 years older than me, that does not mean that people have the right to treat them like a child or to treat them worse than that, to treat them as someone not human. That whole thing I was discussing yesterday, that Dante had said back in the 1300s about people with intellectual disabilities not having a soul. We're getting away from that, thank God. And that can only lead to better things to come. But souls aside, people with intellectual disabilities are still viewed pretty universally as, quote, definitely them, and also we will take care of them, but not anything beyond that. Sometimes they can be considered not teachable or not manageable, but you don't know these things unless you try. All I'm asking out of society is a little bit of effort. And by a little bit, I mean quite a little bit more than what we're getting. This applies to me too, okay? Because I do have exposure to multiple disability groups, shall we say. People with intellectual disabilities, more visibly visually impaired / blind people than I am. I know some deaf people, I know some mobility impaired people, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, there are still stigmas floating around in my head, and it's my job to educate myself and to get rid of those. Just like it's everyone's job to educate themselves and to get rid of those. Because a lot of what fear is based on is pure ignorance. Ignorance is not knowing. Stupidity is not wanting to know. When your fear gets the better of you and gets up to such a pitch that you don't even want to associate with other people who, quote, trigger your fear, or, your attitude of hatred towards them is so solidified by this point that you don't want to learn about them, that is stupidity. And if it were me, I would take a step back from that ledge. But not everyone is going to think in the same way. Not everyone is going to understand even the same issues in the same ways. And that's perfectly fine. The only difference here is how we treat other people. Are we good to them? Do we treat them with dignity? Do we treat them as equal human beings to us? That is where I would draw the line. If you're attempting at least to do that, then you are a lot better than the person who flat out says, no, they are inferior to me. What do I have to do with them? They are taking my resources and yada, yada, yada. Like I say, this is fascism light. Okay, so, yeah, I'm not going to age restrict this one. But please do go and look up the meaning of the word fascism if you are not entirely aware of what it is. but it is a political system and a social system in which the us and the them are very clearly demarcated from one another. And it is also the basis of our current social hierarchy. Yeah, so have fun learning about that. But that's your job, not mine. Because I talk disability on this channel. I talk politics when it is necessary to talk politics in relation to these social issues. Well, issues. But other than that, I like to try and stay as far away from that snake pit as possible. So, educate yourself, please. Treat other people as people, please. And that, at the moment, is the most I can ask of anyone. Alright, so that is my video for today. Tomorrow, I will be coming back with a video on... This one I will age restrict. Forced sterilization. And my opinions thereof. Fun for the whole family. Not. Alright, thank you for your lovely and wonderful attention and support, and I will see y'all tomorrow. Mwah!